Working Together project was an amazing kind of philosophy or thought that we had, and it was something that we'd had conversations at a level individually as organisations around how could we be doing this better? What could we be doing differently? And I think the conversation started to happen broadly across the organisations around, well, how could family services work alongside the family violence sector, and what could we be doing? We're hearing the feedback from our practitioners that they would like some more support in this space, or how we could support them. So conversations started to happen, and we got some really critical people in a room and thought, well, what could we be doing differently? The conversations then started to happen about, oh, maybe we can make a change here. Maybe we can do something differently. Maybe we can do something as a group. And the organisation started to go, well, what if we did this? And we had a bit of a workshop. How could we do this? What would it look like? And we just had a really big kind of mind mapping of what we could do and how we could make it work.
Central Highlands Integrated Family Violence Committee that I'm the PSA of, and the Central Highlands Family Services Alliance that David is the PSA for, were part of this, and it was about kind of ensuring that there was a kind of strategic bringing together of the two sectors. And over time, and it has been quite some time that the Working Together project has been underway, they worked through a number of different projects, some of which worked at that very, the senior leadership level, I suppose. And that led to, I think, as Catherine has said, some really great collaboration at that level. And then it was recognised that actually the practitioners needed to be brought into this space. And so that's where this project, the Collaborative Principal Practitioner project, came from, this focus on working with practitioners, and, as Kristen will talk about, the development of a model that is intended to enable the collaboration of family services and specialist family violence services. I'm going to also add that part of the reason that Siobhan is part of this conversation is because Care Services Alliance, which is the Central Highlands' only innovation, at least at this point, although we're leading the way in that regard as well, was a really important part of coming into this conversation. Sometimes kids in care drop off the map, and so, Siobhan, did you want to talk about how Care Services came into this space?
Yes, so through the work that the PSAs are doing together, we're co-located in a hub alongside the housing PSA. We've been able to look for opportunities across all of our work to link better in with the kinds of work that each other are doing, and to develop joint strategies. So part of that has been to bring care services in to the Working Together project. And as Jess mentioned, young people in care often fall off the map in terms of some of those broader strategic discussions because of the way that our system's structured. So it offers a really fantastic opportunity to be thinking about them and their families in the context of care services work and family violence.
And probably to add to that, as part of the collaborative principal practitioner role, speaking with clients who are in or have been involved in the family violence and family services programs, also have had children, have had children in care, and they were really clear that those children were often left off the map when this work was being done. And in the context of family violence, there was this sense of that when there was safety planning happening, when there was planning happening around how to attempt to improve the safety of the women and children who were living in a particular situation, that often there was this sense that the kids that might have been in care, not here, were not part of that picture, or were not considered, or were not part of that planning, because there was a sense, well, they weren't at risk, but actually, of course they were, because regardless of whether or not they're living there, it has impacts to the relationships across the family. And so this then also led to the conversations that just made sense that this role was involved as well. And that was really that important point around pivoting the project, shifting the project boundaries a little bit in line with the information we were getting from clients.
Yeah,
and centering their experiences as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key things that it helps us to sort of maybe think about or start addressing is that we operate in a context where kinship placements are a really significant and increasing source of placements for children and young people that enter care. And we can lean a little bit on the expertise of family violence practitioners who can help us ensure that our practice isn't perpetuating some of those dynamics within families that have actually led to children coming into care in the first place.
What I think this project really recognises is that there is strength in each of those. Like, it's not about trying to break down the differences between the different expertises or the different skills that are needed for each of those subsectors, but how much are we duplicating and how much are we maybe not getting the best value out of all of our sort of workforce for families and for communities. If we are, as you said before, Catherine, if we aren't kind of thinking about how that can happen differently. So for each of us, we've got a particular focus on a different part of the social service system, and I guess sometimes kind of hear talking about how can we break down the silos. That's the sort of really sort of metaphor that's kind of often used around this. How can we break down the silos? And I guess we're thinking it's not just about. We don't want to just break down silos. Actually, sometimes the keeping them separate is actually really valuable. But how do we actually make sure that we're moving across and between the different ways that we work? And this project's provided some really focused opportunity to do that.
Some of the really key points about the project that we need to mention are that, and going back to points that have already been made to some extent, that we can't just focus on one level of the system. We can't just focus on leadership. We can't just focus on the direct service practitioners. That actually we need to be focusing on all levels. So we've attempted to build that into the project. That really important, referring to, conferring with, getting feedback from, getting ideas and insight and expertise from all levels of the service system, but also having a expectation that there will be changes at each level, and that there's accountability for those changes at each level. So how do we take care of that? That's been a really important part of the process, I think. I think we've learned that you can't just expect direct service practitioners who are run off their feet and have too many clients and all of those things to be making big system changes, or expect that they're just going to work together, because the reality is that we hold very different frameworks, and putting people in a room together doesn't create change. What it does is enables a space, but actually we need to look at the frameworks, and the way in which we've developed the project is to really unpack the differences, the similarities, what they have in common, but what they importantly have that are different in each of those frameworks, where the conflict is occurring. So what are the elephants in the room? And certainly within the service sectors, there's concerns about who is prioritised, how they're prioritised, how safety is understood in the context of family violence, how we need to respond to family violence and what that looks like. And for example, a really big issue is that we have a family violence specialist service system that has a particular way of working that actually, if they work with the victim survivor, there's some separateness to the working with the perpetrator. There's perpetrator services working with perpetrators, but actually in the family services, there's an expectation in many situations that they're working with everybody. So what does that mean about client risk? What does it mean about worker risk? What does it mean about how we take care of children in the context of that? And so this project really needs to unpack those things and make sense of collaboration can be great, but what does it actually mean, and how do we take care of the different positions that people are sitting in and the different risks that they're experiencing at each of those levels? I think that's really important, and I think we've talked a bit about reflective practice. I think one of the things that's really important is that we're reflecting on the ethics and principles that are held by the different service systems and how they might align, but also how they might unexpectedly conflict. There are different ways of approaching this work. There's very individualised ways of approaching. There's very structural, political, system-wide ways of approaching this, and sometimes they don't necessarily intersect well, and there can be conflict there, but within that conflict can be really lovely ways of finding great, creative, diverse ways of approaching seemingly similar situations. And while we're doing that being led by clients. So what does that mean? How do we bring forward the appropriate frameworks based on the situation, based on risk, but also based on what the client is wanting and what best suits their situation. So I think the project's really been framed around looking at different levels. So different levels of the agency, different levels of individual response, organisational response, system response, and why they're all important.
So the structure that developed over time was that under the auspices, I suppose, or under the umbrella of the Family Services Alliance and the Central Highlands Integrated Family Violence Committee, a bunch of organisations, and it's not all of the organisations that are in both of those groups, but a significant cross-section, I suppose, of our membership, got together and began to develop a bit of a sense of wanting to focus a bit on, it's a very innovative title, working together, really, across family services and specialist family violence services. And there, I suppose, one of the things to highlight is that it's not just specialist family violence services and family services in the mix, in this group, in the partnership. There were a bunch of different organisations that could recognise the importance of seeing these two sectors and these two ways of working being brought closer together. So there were a series of different projects that happened over time, and the partnership itself developed over time, which is how we've wound up with our colleague, the Care Services Alliance, also represented there. And when the Orange Door came into Central Highlands, the Service System Navigator was added to the group as well. So it's definitely developed over time. But there have been a series of projects, and some have focused on the kind of senior leadership level, but this particular project was very focused on the collaborative principal practitioner. Catherine, did you want to say a bit more? Because you were part of that history.
I think one of the key things for me, and I just wanted to make sure that we got across as well, is this is one way we went about it in the Central Highlands. Like, we went, let's see how it goes, and we kept developing, we kept morphing, we kept thinking about this as an agile project. We didn't turn around and go, okay, we've nailed it. We're still working on how that looks and moving it into the next phase. But from my perspective, and probably sitting on the chair, it's a constant moving. How do we continue to provide the best support we possibly can for families?
MARAM, which I'm assuming that everyone kind of is aware of MARAM, because or maybe that's just me, it's everywhere in my world at the moment, is the multi-agency risk assessment and management framework, and it's legislated now, which is quite unusual for a piece of policy, really. And of course, we know that I think it's 370,000 workers were brought into MARAM on the 19th of April this year, and that's a big change. And the change that it is meant to achieve is to make family violence everybody's business. And of course, family violence actually was everybody's business always. But it also equips sectors that might not have had access, as you were saying before, Catherine, might not have had access to the expertise of specialist family violence services. That's now captured in quite a large set of practice guides, but also part of why this project matters at this particular moment is because it's about how do we develop practice in a way that also aligns to the expertise that's captured in MARAM.
Family violence is far and away the largest issue that is experienced by families who are within the family services system, and those who are going through often in Child First or the Orange Door. There's various figures kind of around, but from what we've seen, it's around 80%, right, of families in the family services system here in Central Highlands who've experienced family violence, or are experiencing family violence. So it's a real example of the way in which the sort of expertise required, well, why wouldn't we be tapping into the expertise that already existed? There's a whole part of the social service sector that's been built around the particular needs and responding to families experiencing violence. So, there's a really urgent need for us to be not duplicating in that area and to be learning from each other.
And to be responding in ways that, fully address family violence, I think is really key. I think, there's a reason why the Royal Commission into Family Violence, which was the kind of origin point of MARAM, there's a reason why they focused on making family violence everybody's business, literally legislated as everyone's business. And that is because the responses had not been, they had not been adequate to the violence that was being experienced. And I think that's a really key part of the landscape in which this work is happening, is that we are learning how it is. I think sometimes this is part of the complexity in this space, is that we know that it needs to be everybody's business, and we're pretty good at talking about why it needs to be everybody's business, but the how of how we make it everybody's business, how are we actually going to do that in the work that we're doing with clients, that bit is sometimes the bit that needs a bit more working through. And I feel like this project is really focused on the how.
Yeah, and MARAM is such an important tool for doing that, and as you say, to legislate that the change needs to happen, and so that the structures and systems are changing, but how does the practice kind of follow from there? And I guess the different and uneven ways in which that change has occurred within different parts of the social service sector, that those who have been working in family violence for years and generations and have been kind of part of that change are much more familiar with the ways of working. So how do we enable people to learn from each other in that way, so that it's not just a system change, but it's a cultural change?
I think that's been a really interesting point in terms of the timing of the project, and the fact that there's been this momentum occurring, prior to the Royal Commission and prior to MARAM and those things. However, what it's enabled me to do in the collaborative principal practitioner role is to actually leverage off those changes, and so it's that idea of, for example, that there is this absolute motivation in the agencies to look at collaborating, what that looks like. But for me in this role, it's been this really lovely possibility of talking about intersectionality, talking about how do we take care of power and privilege in the way we're working with clients, which is what MARAM asks of us. But actually, you can't just do it in that space. You have to do it at all levels. So how do we take care of power and privilege within organisations, between workers? In case plan meetings where you've got clients and workers sitting together, how are we taking care of that in all of those areas, so that we're not replicating some of those, power imbalances and power issues that are occurring not only in the family violence space but more broadly in society. So MARAM has actually given a level of power to some of that we might not have had before. So in reference to your comments about being somewhat outside in terms of the funding coming from the agencies, yes, that has this lovely freedom to it. But MARAM has also provided some of that ability to be able to say, well, actually, the role can support some of those changes and what is required of us now by the state, but do it in a way that makes sense locally and makes sense within this region, and that is informed primarily by the clients that we're speaking to. So the client reference group really is the group of people that I take all this information back to, and everything that workers are talking about, I provide to them and talk about, what do you think? What does this look like? Does this make sense to you? Are we on the right track? Those sort of ideas. That intersectional analysis and that client-centered approach, those really key ideas that are in MARAM have been enabled by this project, but I think supported obviously by the project itself. the collaborative principal practitioner role, as I've kind of constructed it and reconstructed it, is really through that participatory action approach, which actually allows it to shift and change based on what's needed. So what was really important initially was, for me, was to set up the client group as the reference group. So being really clear that we're being led by client voice, client experience, and not just a kind of a chat at the beginning and then a chat at the end to see whether they've noticed any changes, but actually have their input all the way through the project. And every time there's a key something happens in the project, I take that back to the group of people that we've been able to put together in order to get their feedback. And so that was a really critical role. I think the project for me has had some key components. You talked about being reflective. The reflective practice sessions that we're holding are really critical in the project. The way in which I've constructed them both enables us to have the conversations that are really important, and some of those do link into the ideas in Marram. So those really critical ideas about power, what does power look like, how do we take care of it, which for me allows us to have the conversations to embed some of that intersectional approach, for example, to the way we work, but also to collaboration and to working together and what that looks like. So those reflective practice spaces are really enabling us to move and shift depending on what's needed. So, for example, we hold a reflective practice session. There's a lot of input from the participants. I try and frame those sessions so that they actually give back to the project. They're not just random topics. They're actually really important to the project. Take that information, take it back and share it to some level with everybody's consent with clients, get their input and see what we're missing. It's really important for us to mention here, but because I think it's quite unique to the Central Highlands area, is that we actually have a combined allocations process being set up so that family services and family violence services are receiving new allocations from the Orange Door together in an allocations process. The way it's structured is that there's allocations that occur in the family services space, there's allocations that occur in the family violence space, but then there's those cases where they believe both services are required. That's allocated in a space together, and I think that's been a really critical part of this project that came along that we didn't expect at the beginning of the project. It wasn't necessarily in view, but that's been a lovely space in terms of setting up some research and watching how that's gone, what that's like, what are we learning from that space, what's really important, how can we support it as part of the project. So things like there's a coordinator role being set up. So if a case is allocated to both the family violence space and the family services space, that a coordinator role has been designed because, of course, we want really clear pathways about who's responsible for what and no lag in terms of who's taking the lead in a situation. Now that coordinator role hasn't necessarily been designed up because it's something that's evolved from the learnings that have occurred through those spaces. And so I think the project has been able to say, well, hey, we'll support with that. So we've done a bit of research. We're talking to any of the agency workers who have been a part of that, noting down what we can about what's important to ask, what's important to have, so that we've got a document that'll be able to say, well, this is what the coordinator's role is, this is what you're responsible for, this is what other participating agencies will be responsible for. So that really kind of practical work that's really going to support that combined allocation space.
I was just going to say that actually it's quite a nice example, I think, of the different levels at which the project operates, because the intention to develop what's now known as combined allocations actually came from the working together partnership. It was an action from one of the meetings that Dave and myself and the service system navigator from the Orange Door would start to develop this space, and that it's taken some time. But I think it's also interesting that it's the point at which we have the pilot reflection moment. We've had this pilot, now where are we up to? Where it became clear that actually practitioners weren't clear about how to navigate this combined space. What did it mean that there was a lead agency? Did that mean that the other agency was just there for secondary consultation, or were they expected to be carrying some part? And I think that really demonstrates the need in this space for some clarity about how it is that the practitioners are going to be working together. It's no longer a lead agency, it's now a coordinating agency. So these are the kinds of changes that we see, and then the coordinator role is being worked up, the kind of position description, for want of a better term, for that role. So it's a very practical, but you can see the kind of movement between the layers of the service system, from that strategic all the way on down to embedding in practice.
In the family services sector, we went from, I think initially it was fortnightly allocation sessions under Child First. Then when COVID hit, we moved into weekly allocation sessions because there was a added sense of urgency and uncertainty. Then when we brought in combined allocations, where there's a practice of really rapidly moving through allocations processes to make sure, then we moved to twice weekly, and that was a real challenge for a lot of practitioners. They've gone from their number of meetings had actually increased, and in what was already a pretty challenging environment with people's time. So But we knew that's what was needed, to address demand pressures.
To address demand, and also to ensure that safety was central to the whole process. And that was the lens that family violence brought in. We can't wait a week. We can't wait a week to allocate cases where someone may be at risk right now. And so that urgency kind of brought into that space. And that's part of that, the kind of the knitting together or the weaving together of these two spaces. And
it needed the leadership from the Working Together project for the leaders within the system to say, no, we're actually doing this because of that there is that this is addressing, this is a change to practice. Now, we had a review session of that 3 months later, so just a month or so ago, and the family services practitioners, we love the twice weekly allocations. It's the best because it means that if we can pick something up and it's only a couple of days, and we know that we're not actually going to leave the families in danger, and so that's kind of led practice change in this really tangible way. I think that's the combined allocations process is a really good example of how all of these big principles that we've been talking about of working together and breaking down the barriers and the fractured service system are coming together in real life.
And I think, David, to add to that, it was a culture change as well.
And some of what we talked about were things like, how do we, through this, we started with victim-survivor case management, how do we, through this process, make sure that we are keeping perpetrators in view? How do we make sure that we're giving due account to children as victim survivors in their own right? And some of that was about what information is shared at what point. And some of it was also about just having enough services in the room that we knew, although we were not allocating to perpetrator services at that point in time because demand was just far too high through COVID to actually be able to respond. But having them in the room meant that we knew who they were with, who was working with particular perpetrators. So we got additional information. And then that work that we did over a span of, I think it was started in April 2020 till about, I think November, we moved over to the Orange Door. In that period, I think it also helped practitioners in these spaces get their heads around what joint allocations could offer. So it meant that when the combined allocations processes started, people had a clearer sense of what they were going to be doing in that room. And that although we talk about it as if it was just allocations, as if we were just parceling out names to different people, actually, any allocations process is a lot more involved and a lot more engaged than that. And some of how we make sure that children are recognised as victim survivors in their own right and as part of families, and also about how we keep perpetrators in view and held to account. Lots of that happens in those conversations about who it is who's doing what and what responsibilities, and how are we making sure that we are closing the loop on all of these cases? How are we making sure that we are actually providing the response that's needed? And I think that what the model here that Kristen's working on is going to produce is, the allocations is the front door. Like it's a great front door, don't get me wrong. I'm pretty proud that we've managed to work towards that. But I also think that it is only the front door, and there's the whole bit that comes after that that really needs the work. And that's where Kristen's doing lots of the work, and I can see already in the kind of conversations that we're having through reflective practice, yes, I sit in on them occasionally, that you can actually see people coming to grips with what it means to be doing this work together, what it is that needs to be worked through together. And as we've said, it's not about, busting silos and homogenising everyone. It's actually about building a level of recognition and respect for the expertise that is held in different spaces and bringing that together. And to me, that is core to MARAM. Like we run, as all regional integration committees do, we run MARAM collaborative practice, and that's kind of key to what it does. But this is about embedding it really robustly in practice.
It's demonstrating the value of having strategic thinking and strategic action in regions. That it's not actually, Victoria can be a very sort of metrocentric sort of place or service system. But there's actually a lot of expertise and a lot of different service systems and different ways of looking at that have developed here in the regions. Central Highlands is an example of that. So I'm always thinking about how can we be leading from the regions rather than working within the centralised policy environments. How can we lead within that? And I think the capacity and the leadership potential in this area, as in all areas and regions around Victoria, is massive. And I think this is what this does. It kind of shows the different levels at which leadership can occur. So I think this is a really good example of how we can be doing that.
Particularly for me, one of the biggest learnings for me has been in consultation with one of our clients who's in the reference group, who's an Aboriginal woman, talking about her experience of the family violence sector, the family service sector and the care sector, and the really problematic, still ingrained racist responses that exist within that sector, and within each of those sectors, within the institutions more broadly in Australia. And that I think, for me, that really embedding decolonising approaches to the work is really critical, and what that looks like is still evolving, but certainly influencing all the way along, and embedding that in each component. So thinking about, it's that intersectional approach again, but specifically I think focusing on frameworks and theories that can support us. And I think decolonisation, theory in itself is really useful across different intersections, but certainly needs to be focused on in terms of the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members. And so, for example, some of our approaches are around looking at community and the importance of community, the importance of looking at and researching further into the future around having approaches and addressing family violence outside of the mandated system, outside of the statutory system, outside of police legal system. Not that those systems don't have their place, but that we really need to make sure we have alternatives, and alternatives for people who do not want to intersect with those systems. And that could be Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, it could be LGBTIQ plus people who have had histories and really problematic engagements and experiences of policing, etc. And not that those systems aren't doing all sorts of work to improve in those ways, but that we've got to be where clients are at and where those clients' experiences are at. So for me, there's a real opportunity for us to diversify out. And once we get this sort of model happening, that then we start inviting more people in, more sectors in. What does it look like if we start having more of a mandated service system, involvement in this in terms of accountability to our responses to family violence? What does it mean when we, broadening out? So some of the services that are already represented by the project, now of course they've been involved in that reflective practice space because it's been important to have their voices in that space, but to have those service systems more involved. So I think I think what's really critical is the project is never ending. It's not a project, and that's not for me trying to keep my job for the next 30 years, but it is honestly a never ending project, whatever formula it comes in, and it might not always be a person's role, but it's that idea of that it's a process. We will never achieve the perfect anything. There will always be issues, there will always be constraints. The idea of collaboration, the idea of community, the idea of working together will continue to evolve and continue to change and continue to need to adapt depending on where we're at in the world. And so that's really critical for me, is not expecting to get to the end and tick some boxes and okay, we do collaboration now, because that's a really problematic idea, because it's relationships, right? It's relational. We need to continue to build and develop and find our faults and work on them and learn from each other and adapt and change.
I think it offers us an incredible opportunity to really reflect more on how we conceptualise who our client is. The care services space is sort of an ultimate outcome of all of the work that's come before it, and so there's a couple of things that we can do with that and with that position, and part of it is that we have the opportunity to feed back into the system with greater collaboration, the way that this project has been working, about what hasn't worked for some of the families that we worked in, what has maybe some of our services missed in the way that we've worked with the families.
The future of the project feels to me about actually coming to real grips with what intersectionality means in this space. We use it a lot, the term, it's getting chucked around a lot. MARAM is like, everyone's like, yes, it's not diversity anymore, it's intersectionality. And in some ways it is, but actually everyone, all identities, whether or not they're marginalised and oppressed, are intersectional in the sense that they are connected to a variety of different communities. And I think there's something exciting about this project about, I talked before about not breaking people down into their needs based on the sector that is going to be serving them, so much as actually responding to them as whole people embedded in their community and embedded in what are actually support networks that could be activated to support that. And I think, we talked a bit about MARAM making family violence everybody's business. I think we need to mean that, and mean that it's not just a service sector response, but actually a community response to family violence. And I feel like this project has the potential to, through decolonisation, which does focus on finding alternatives to state-based responses, I think this project has the potential to move into spaces that bring community into the space of caring for people who are navigating really tough circumstances and circumstances where they are at risk. And I think that's a great potential of this project.
I've written down a couple of words, and I really like to, I want leadership, and I want organisations, and I want us to be system disruptors. I want us to start thinking about how the system works, how it doesn't work. So I want us to continue to do that moving forward. And through this project, I think there's been a massive amount of work to look at how do we disrupt a system to then rebuild it to make the system a little bit better. I want to see that the agency continues to support the important work that's being done through the Working Together project. I want to see innovation and creativity grow. I want to see conversations, courageous conversations happening where we're challenging the status quo, and we're not just going to put up with something because we can't think of another way of doing this. We want to bring people into the room to have those conversations. So for me, it's about, I want to continue to see disruptors and to ask questions and think about how we could do this differently and how we can engage people in these conversations to then really, really break down those silos. And I think, as Dave said before, we do have silos and we have reasons for silos, but I think if we didn't have so many silos across the organisations, across service systems and across streams, we may actually be able to get some of this work done. So I think for me, this is groundbreaking work, and I think it's the beginning of something. And I challenge you to go out and try to do something and have a go at it.